Summary of Intimate Apparel by Lynn Nottage. New York City is in the year 1905. The story begins in Esther's bedroom, where she is seen stitching a blouse while a party is going on downstairs. Mrs. Dixon goes upstairs to try and convince Esther to come to the party and dance with Mr. Charles, who is a good-looking single man. Esther isn't interested in Mr. Charles, and she's also jealous of Karina May, who is getting engaged and is the party's guest of honor. Esther has lived in the boarding house for 18 years, and during that time, 22 girls have gotten married. Esther wants to get married so badly and hates those other girls. Mrs. Dixon tells Esther that her time will come and tells her to marry a guy who makes money. As she leaves, she gives Esther a letter from a guy named George, but she won't read it out loud. George comes out and reads his letter. He is working on the Panama Canal, and a friend told him about Esther. He wants to start writing to you. Esther goes to the bedroom of Mrs. Van Buren, a rich white woman, to give her a new, very low-cut corset. Mrs. Van Buren asked for a dress like the ones sex workers wear. She is very self-conscious about how she looks in it, but she thinks it's the only way to get her husband's attention again. When Esther touches Mrs. Van Buren to fix the corset, Mrs. Van Buren tense up. Mrs. Van Buren is sad that she has to go to a ball this evening, where everyone will ask her when she and her husband are going to have a baby. They have been trying, but Mrs. Van Buren says in a whisper that she isn't sure if she can have children. Esther tells Mrs. Van Buren that her husband won't leave her because she's too pretty, and they talk about whether or not it's okay for a woman to be single. Mrs. Van Buren says that she would leave her husband if she were brave enough to do so. Esther says she got a letter from a man in Panama, but she doesn't know how to read or write, so she can't answer. Mrs. Van Buren helps Esther write a letter with excitement, and George writes to Esther again. He says that the Panama Canal seems like a crazy dream, and even though he loves the stories his coworkers tell, he can now hear Esther's sewing machine in his head. Esther goes to the apartment of Mr. Marks to buy fabric. He talks her into buying some beautiful Japanese silk and suggests that she turn it into a smoking jacket for her guy. They make fun of each other, talk about the silk, and Mr. Marks says nice things about Esther's taste in fabric and her sewing skills. Esther says that she could have been a maid instead, and she grabs Mr. Marks's hand to show how happy she is about the fabric. He backs up. Esther is shocked and hurt, but Mr. Marks says that because he is Jewish, he can only touch women who are his wife or cousins. He says he's going to marry a woman in Romania he's never met. Mamie, a black woman who works as a prostitute, is yelling at her piano, and Esther lets herself in. Mamie just got her robe torn by a man, and she spits that she hates how men touch her. Esther shows her the blue corset she brought. It looks just like the one she made for Mrs. Van Buren. Esther says that Mrs. Van Buren and Mamie both want what the other has as she ties Mamie into it. Mamie makes fun of Esther for having a crush on Mr. Marks when she talks about him, but Esther brings up George. Mamie doesn't believe Esther at first, but she tells her in a nice way that it's okay to dream. They act like they are rich women in Europe. Mamie says she is a musician, and Esther says she owns a beauty shop for black women. Esther tells the truth that she has saved enough money in her crazy quilt to open her beauty shop, but Mamie tells her to give up on this dream. She says it's fun to dream, but dreams aren't real. The most current letter from George is talked about, and Mamie writes Esther's return. George writes back that he has been thinking about New York and the suit he will wear when he meets Esther. Mrs. Dixon brings a letter from George back to Esther's room. She already opened it and read it. Mrs. Dixon thinks that George will take advantage of Esther, but Esther tells her that she doesn't need approval and won't settle for someone like Mr. Charles. She has money and will open her beauty shop, man or no man. The letter is torn up by Mrs. Dixon. George starts to write a message to Esther, but the scene changes to Mr. Marks' room. He and Esther wrap themselves in beautiful blue and fuchsia silk, and Esther asks him why he always wears black. He says that it's how he shows his loyalty to God and that his old suit was his father's and ties him to his ancestors. Esther touches his collar as he turns to wrap up the silk. Mrs. Van Buren wears her new fuchsia silk corset in her bedroom. She moans about having to go to the opera and says her husband spat at her when she got her period early. Mrs. Van Buren says she would like to see a colored show while Esther fixes her breasts in the corset. She asks Esther to take her, but she laughs when Esther offers to take her to the opera in exchange. Esther says that she's afraid that George is falling in love with her, and both Mrs. Van Buren and Esther say that they've done things behind their husbands' backs that they're not proud of. In his next letter to Esther, George asks her to marry him and tells her how much he loves her. Mamie finds out about it later from Esther. She tells Mamie that this is her only chance to get married and asks her to be a witness, but Mamie says no. Later, when Mrs. Dixon is helping Esther pack, she won't let her take a dowdy dress and gives her marriage advice, which is to take care of George's sexual needs in any way she has to if she wants him to stay home and not let him beat her. She tells Esther that she doesn't have to get married and tells her about how her own mother made her marry up instead of marrying for love so she wouldn't have to be a laundress. Her husband was an opium user, but she ended up with the boarding house. Esther goes to Mr. Marks's store and asks for wedding dress fabric. She asks for his plainest fabric, which he says is for an older woman. When he finds out that Esther is the bride, he feels ashamed. He gives her the most beautiful wedding fabric he has, and she cries into it. On stage come Mamie, Mrs. Van Buren, Mr. Marks, and Mrs. Dixon. As Esther and George walk in wearing their wedding clothes, a camera flashes and a label that says Unidentified Negro Couple, ca. 1905 inch appears. George and Esther both stand on their bed. George starts to take off his suit without thinking. Esther carefully folds it while she sits with him and shakes. Esther says that she is not pretty, but she is truthful. George takes off her dress and touches her, but Esther gets up and gives George a smoking jacket she made out of Japanese silk. He puts it on, but it makes him feel bad, so he takes it off quickly. Esther wants to talk to him before they make love, so she tells him about her family. George isn't interested because his parents were slaves and he doesn't want to talk about them. After Esther and George have sex, Mamie and Mrs. Van Buren come to help Esther get dressed. A few months later, George gets ready to go out in a worn-out suit, even though Esther says it's Sunday and they have plans at Mrs. Dixon's and at church. George doesn't want to go to either, so he asks his parents for money to buy a new hat. Esther pulls money out of her crazy blanket for him and asks him to let her fix his shirt before he goes out. If he goes out looking bad, people will say bad things about her. George talks about how he can't find work, which makes him angry. He gives Esther a letter from his boss, and Esther acts like she is reading it. George gives Esther his shirt and then goes to sleep. Esther tries one last time to get her to go to the church party, since she hasn't been asked to anything since she and Mordecai got married. George says no and that he doesn't feel good enough because Esther has a job. He says that he knows a man who is trying to sell 12 draft horses, and he wants to use the money in Esther's crazy quilt to buy them. Esther says no and tells George about her beauty salon, but George laughs and says that Esther is too ugly to run a beauty salon. He tries to tell her that she would look better with lipstick on, but she won't. George puts on his half-done shirt and tells Esther where he's going. She says the place is notorious, and they fight about how unhappy George is in America and in their marriage. Later, Esther goes to Mr. Marks to buy wool from Scotland to make George a suit. Mr. Marks also tries to sell her lace, but Esther tells him she can't come back. The next time Esther goes to see Mrs. Van Buren, the white woman is very happy. Her husband has gone to Europe and won't be back for months. Mrs. Van Buren is annoyed by how busy and sad Esther is. Esther tells Mrs. Van Buren that George isn't happy and asks her to pay her. Mrs. Van Buren talks about the letters she wrote to George, which makes Esther get angry. Esther sobs that she lied to George, and Mrs. Van Buren kisses Esther. Mrs. Van Buren tells Esther that she loves her and that they can still be friends, but Esther pulls away. Esther is angry and says they can't be friends if she can't use the front door, even if she's the only person who makes Mrs. Van Buren happy. As Mrs. Van Buren pays Esther, George goes into Mamie's room, puts money on her piano, and sits behind her. Esther goes to see Mamie, who is happy because a guy she calls Songbird has been coming to her house often. He says that his wife is too rich. She takes out the smoking jacket that Esther gave to George and says that Songbird, which is another name for George, gave it to her. Esther tries to get Mamie to think about the wives of the men she sees, but Mamie is hurt by Esther's lack of support and says no. Later, Esther pins George's new pants to his suit. He won't let her shorten them because he needs to wear them out tonight, he says. Esther puts on makeup and acts sexy to keep George at home, but George is turned off by it. He says that she won't let him buy the draft horses because she wants to control him and doesn't believe in him. He gives her a rough kiss and tells her that if he can buy the draft horses, he'll pay for her beauty salon and be home every night if he can buy the horses. Esther gives all of her money to George. She says that she can't read or write and that she thinks George is the same way. George confirms this, and Esther says that they know each other less now than when they got married. George says he will bring horses back. Esther runs into Mamie's room in a rage. She says that George broke up with her and is seeing someone else. She tells Mamie that she gave George the money for her beauty salon and asks if Mamie knows where George is because she is wearing his smoking jacket. Mamie is shocked to find out that Songbird is really George, but George says that he came in last night wearing a new suit, played dice, and spent all the money. Mamie gives Esther the smoking jacket, and when George knocks on the door, Esther tells Mamie not to open it. Esther goes to see Mr. Marks the next day and gives him the smoking jacket. He's moved by it, so he puts on the colored garment and lets Esther fix it. When Esther goes back to Mrs. Dixon's boarding house, Mrs. Dixon agrees to take her back and not ask any questions. Esther sits at her sewing machine, and the scene transforms into a picture titled Unidentified Negro Seamstress, circa 1905.
About the author. Lynn Nottage was born in the New York City of Brooklyn. When she was 8 years old, she wrote her first play. She went to Brown University as a young adult and then got her MFA in playwriting from Yale. She worked for Amnesty Foreign as a foreign press officer for a few years before becoming a full-time writer in the 1990s. Crumbs from the Table of Joy, which she wrote in 1995, was her first full-length play that got a lot of attention. One of her best-known plays is called Intimate Apparel. After opening in California, the play opened off-Broadway with Viola Davis in the lead role. Since then, it has become one of the most performed plays in the United States. Nottage's first play on Broadway was Sweat, which she wrote in 2015. Nottage has written plays and worked on multimedia projects. She has also written for TV and helped start the production company Market Road Films. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and 2 kids.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.